Welcome back. So, here to talk about inequalities across Africa as occasioned by the COVID-19 pandemic, matters arising, is Edwin Ikhuoria, Executive Director of One Campaign. It's good to have you with us, joining us all the way from UK via Zoom. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here as well.
All right, thank you. Let's dive straight into it. Africans, as Africans, we're all at this point in time tired of hearing news about COVID-19. We just want our life back. We want to go back to work. We want to go back to school. We want to go back to the way things are. Why should we care about any more new COVID-19 news protocols or anything like that?
In fact, I can tell you that as we speak right now, Africa as a whole is experiencing what we call the third wave, and with the prediction that it might even get into the third wave, into the fourth wave. Now, there are two reasons why you should care. You should care because, like the initial report that was just done, show that your lives can never go back to normal as long as the world is still suffering this pandemic. We may not have seen dead bodies on the street yet in Africa. We may not have seen the level of mass infection that showed up in other places of the world, like India more recently. But we are currently battling with the economic aftershocks, of this pandemic. Now, let me give you an example why you should care. In terms of public services, in terms of a system where the government does not have enough finances to even implement its own budget, right? That is something that would affect every aspect of this economy. And as long as the pandemic is in place and trade is disrupted, like you put in the report, we would constantly, have that liquidity problem, that fiscal problem, where we're not able to raise enough money to run even the government or run public services the way they should. Why should you care? You should care because as long as we are part of a global system where without the pandemic getting over, you will not be able to interact with other parts of the world without all of the protocols. With slow trade, slow consumption, slow investment, of course, it will mean job losses. It will mean that people cannot afford the things they used to afford. You should care because, in fact, if things don't take the different shape right now, if we don't get rid of this pandemic and get back to normal, there's a likelihood that businesses would never go back to normal. There's a likelihood that sales will never go back to normal. There's a likelihood that even the farm produce that, if you say many of our people are farmers, the things you produce would never get the people to buy them. The reason is that the market is limited, finances are constrained. So if these things don't go back to normal, apart from the health implication that we will talk about, the economic implication is far, far, far more devastating, not just for Nigeria, but for many countries across the world. So that's the reason why it has to be dealt with right now. We have to get this pandemic out of our way and then things go back to normal.
Okay, so in Africa, we like to get things done with very quickly. What do we need to do next? We're tired of the bad news. We're tired of this, the doom and gloom and all of that. What do we need to do next?
Thank you. First of all, there are several dimensions to this, but the very first and most important thing right now is the availability of vaccines. That is like the critical part. We're all, thankful to God and to science that when the pandemic came and all of the investments were made, especially in the rich countries, the risk, or rather the investment, resulted in breakthroughs, what we call vaccines today. And because of that, people can go back to, things can go back to what looked like normal. If you recall, in the Euros that just ended, you see stadiums were packed full in England, in Europe, across Europe, because most of them have taken the vaccines. But that cannot happen in Africa yet, because if we see such kind of mass gathering, as we saw in India, for instance, after the festival and there was a mass gathering of different political rallies and the religious festival, it led to a major outbreak that, led to many people dying. And in fact, the predicted dead bodies on the street realistically happened in India. So that's the reason why we can't do that. And until we get a lot more people vaccinated, right? A lot more people who can, so that even when they contract the virus, they're not going to die from the virus or from the illness that comes with it. Until we come to that point where most people, what we call herd immunity, where we can no longer transmit or we can now live with the virus without the fear of dying from it, that is the only time we can begin to get back to normal. So access to those vaccines are important. We're quite impressed that recently we got some batch of doses of vaccines donated by the US, that Moderna vaccine that came to Nigeria, I would advise that people should go out and take those vaccines as much as they can, so that is the only time we can be inching near normalcy to fight the virus.
All right. Across Africa, you've been doing this, you've traveled around, you've gotten information. What's the situation been like across Africa in various sectors, in trade, in education, in health and all of that? What's been your experience across Africa?
Now, let me explain this. One of the biggest impacts of the pandemic is on all of the sectors that was mentioned in the report. The report captured it so abruptly, so it was so succinct in the way you put that report out. Because when the pandemic happened, now there was lockdown. That was the first policy response. It was to halt the spread of the pandemic, let us lock down. This happened across the continent. In fact, it happened across the world. What was the first result of that? Many of the things went online. When things go online, in Africa, it is a disaster for us because almost 80% of the continent is not connected to the internet. And what does that mean? It means that the few people who were connected to the internet were the only ones who could continue, in quote, their life as normal. When I say normal, in the sense that they could move online. But for the majority of people, they could not move normal. They could not move online. Now, that is one first area. In education, the majority of Africans could not go to school, could not learn. It's not just about going to school, it's also about learning. So, and once we saw that, it became that was the first impact of the pandemic. There was structural inequality. The haves can go back, continue with their lives, but the have-nots cannot continue with their lives. Now, when you look at that, that's on the first front. On the other front is in terms of the costs of even getting treatments. You see that across the continent, many people could not afford to pay for the treatment for COVID-19. So only the rich that could afford it. So those who could not afford it, of course, die off, especially because there was no cure. But at least for those who could even go and get treatment for themselves, in public health, I mean, the government tried to take care of people, but most people could not even go to the hospital. So what you saw was like, unexplained deaths in many parts of across the continent. And so once that was happening, you could see that the major difference. So there is a health impact in terms of inequality. There's the education impact in terms of inequality. Then let's look at the food purchasing or selling of things. Businesses closed down, practically closed down. Only businesses who had the technology and the resources to be able to move online are the ones that continued. And of course, in across the world, what you saw is that our government did their best. They could to support what they could support. But in many developed countries, like in the UK where I am, there's what they call the furlough, where the government had to even pay business owners to retain their workers so that they would not lose their jobs, so that they could not lay people off. But that couldn't happen in Africa because we simply cannot afford it. The inequality was so open across the world that rich countries continue their life normally, but poor countries cannot continue normally. As you may know, in the US and Europe, they spent trillions of dollars. I'm not talking of trillions of naira, trillions of dollars to stimulate their economy. That was not possible in Africa, across Africa. So many African countries spent what they could spend to boost the healthcare system, to support businesses, but you couldn't see that across the continent because, of course, our fiscal resources are so small compared to the rest of the world. And that is why right now, when the IMF just approved, the Board of Governors just approved the SDR, what we call the special drawing rights, which is basically like the global central bank printing money and distributing to all its member states. But what we're still seeing in that case is that the rich countries will get the bulk of that money, even though they don't need it, because they have the capacity to print their own money and borrow in trillions. But African countries that cannot, that need it, are only going to get a small part of these SDRs. So this is the inequality, broad inequalities. The rich countries are moving on. The poor countries, are struggling and trying to just survive.
Let me interject there a bit. So, in the face of this inequality, especially what you just mentioned about, we need to borrow more money to be able to move on, but we don't have access to borrow this money. What can we do as a continent to ensure that we do not find ourselves 100 years behind in the next decade or so?
So first of all, it takes investments, strategic investment. I would use that word because, first of all, there are several things that would make us not prepared for the next pandemic. If we continue to underinvest in our health system because we think it's a social expenditure, it is an expenditure that is not coming back, it's dead money. If we continue to view the health sector and our education sector as sectors that are just dead money, we will continue to miss it. So right now, what you want to get African countries to do is strategic investment in the sectors that really, when they go bad, it will upend everything. So investments in health, investments in education, strategically, as a part of our national budget, as a part of all the states' budget, you know, a larger percentage. There are some thresholds that have been set globally for these two sectors. We continue to do all of those. So then it makes us better prepared for the next pandemic. But that is on one side. But the other side is just to improve governance, because the rate at which African countries borrow money globally is the highest in the world. The US can borrow money at 0.5% interest per annum, but African countries is from between 5, 7, and 10% per annum. That puts us in strategic, real huge debt going forward. So we have to structure what creates the risk. What are the things that give the perception of risk to African countries, so that when we even want to access international financial markets, we are not put at a disadvantage and continue to borrow at exorbitant rates. Those are the things we have to structurally deal with, you know, to ensure that we prove to the rest of the world, to the financial, to the global economy, that we are a place that when they put their money, they can get their money back. Those are some things that we have to strategically, but also to think about it. When you look at why are we in this situation? Why are we so badly hit? We've been growing, but our growth has not been inclusive. When I say we're growing, 7 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world were in Africa before the pandemic. But right now, while other economies, because of the massive inflow they put into their economies, will recover quickly by 2022, Africa will still just be lagging behind. Now, what do we want to think about? We want to think about, how do we invest in the sectors that are really inclusive? How do we try to increase productivity in sectors like agriculture?
Yeah. Yeah, so speaking about agriculture, I've just been told.
Let me just wrap up my thoughts here.
Right.
Once we get more people that are more economically productive, we are more likely to get people who are resilient, who can afford, you know, to pay their taxes back, and then we can increase our what we call our base, our tax base, and then we can have the money to invest in all the sectors that we need to do. Those are some structural changes that need to happen, you know, against the next pandemic.
All right, so I'm going to ask, lastly, how is it possible for us to depoliticize our vaccine process and ensure that the most critical sectors that need it get it first? For example, farming, education, security, those critical sectors that we need to get the system back up. And unfortunately, this is the last question we can take. What do we do to ensure that these processes are depoliticized, and the farmers and the nurses and the education people who need it, get them, so we can get our country back?
The truth of the matter is that if you don't get it right, you are done for. So I don't think we need anybody to preach that to any system.
Yeah.
If you don't get the system right, you are done for, because you are in an international environment where if the vaccine already, if the virus or the pandemic is still raging in your country, you will be kept out, you'll be shut out. I'm sure you already know that now. There is what we call the vaccine passport going around in Europe. So without the vaccine passport, you don't go. So if we don't prioritize the sectors that are quite important for us to get us back to normal, and the virus continues to show up in our jurisdiction, we will be shut out. And that implies that we will lose on many fronts. And so it is also take the time to follow the science, follow the process that will enable us come out of this as quickly as possible. Politics will not help us if we want to get out of this. And that's my, you know, the easiest answer I can give on that front.
Well, thank you very much. It's been quite enlightening and an engaging conversation. We hope that we'll have you back in the studio not too long from now to follow up on some of these issues that we've discussed about. We really do hope that African leaders across the continent are able to pick up steam and put politics aside and get things going. Thank you very much. Hope to see you again.